So you did the thing the last video told you to do. You idled out over deep water, you took the unit off auto, you cranked the gain, you killed the filters, and there it was. That flat, fuzzy gray line sitting at one steady depth. The Thermocline. Congratulations. You found it in 30 seconds, just like they promised. And then you fished it, and at first light you loaded the boat, and by lunchtime that exact same spot was a graveyard. Same water, same temperature line, same gray band on the screen, and you sat there wondering what you did wrong. Here is the part nobody tells you. You didn't do anything wrong. The fish didn't leave. The dinner table moved. It slid down through the whole morning, quiet as a shadow, and it will climb right back up this evening. And it does that every single day, on a clock so regular you could set your watch by it. Finding the Thermocline was never the cheat code. The Thermocline is a fence. It tells you the size of the room. It does not tell you where the table is, and the table is what you came for. By the end of this, you are going to read a second layer, a moving one, that rides above the Thermocline and rises and falls with the light. You'll know the 2 exact windows it opens every day. You'll know how to watch it slide on the cheapest, oldest sonar you own. And you'll know why the tackle industry has 0 reason to ever tell you any of it. No invented studies, no made-up names. Everything here traces back to a real fisheries biologist, a real limnologist, or a resource agency you can look up yourself. I've watched anglers anchor on a depth number for years and swear the lake betrayed them, when the truth was sitting right there in the water the whole time, just moving. So let's kill the first misunderstanding fast, because it's the one that wastes the most time. When a lake stratifies in summer, it stacks into 3 layers. Warm, light water floats on top. Cold, heavy water sinks to the bottom. And between them sits that thin transition zone, the one your sonar draws as a gray line, where the temperature falls off a cliff in just a few feet. That middle line is the Thermocline. Now here is what the 30-second video quietly skips. That line is a ceiling and a floor, not a target. Below it, in a lot of summer lakes, the water has gone stale and short on oxygen, so the fish can't live down there. Above it, the water is livable. So all the Thermocline really tells you is the height of the room the fish are trapped in. It draws you the walls. It does not draw you the food. And inside that room, the food is on an elevator. That elevator is run by something you have never once seen and never bought a single package of. Zooplankton. Tiny drifting animals, most of them smaller than a grain of rice. And they are the base of the entire open water food chain. Nothing swims in that lake without them. And every 24 hours, that whole cloud of them runs a vertical migration, deep and dark by day, up toward the surface by night. Scientists have a name for it, Deal vertical migration, and it is one of the largest movements of living things on the planet, happening in your local reservoir every night while you sleep. Now, why would a tiny animal bother climbing up and down a lake every single day? For a long time, nobody agreed. Some thought it was about temperature, about saving energy in the cold. That debate got settled, and it's worth knowing who settled it, because this is the kind of source I'll actually stand behind. Back in 1976, 2 researchers named Zaret and Suffern first laid out the real answer. Then a limnologist named Winfried Lampert, working at the Max Planck Institute for Limnology in Plön, built giant indoor water columns he called plankton towers and proved it cold. The zooplankton climb up and down to hide, down in the dark by day, where fish can't see to eat them, up to the rich surface food at night, under the cover of darkness. It's a nightly game of hide and seek, and light is what starts the clock. And here's the detail that should raise the hair on your arm a little. Those tiny animals can smell fish. When there are predators in the water, the fish leak a chemical cue into it, and the zooplankton pick up on that smell and dive deeper and stay down longer. Fear literally pushes them down the water column. So the elevator has 2 controls. Light is the master switch that runs it up and down each day. And the presence of predators is the fine-tuning that decides exactly how deep they hide. Hold on to that, because it means the bait cloud isn't just following the sun. It's flinching away from the very fish you're trying to catch. So now walk the food chain up, because this is where it becomes about your rod. Shad, the #1 bait fish in most American reservoirs, spend their young lives eating zooplankton out in the open water. So the shad follow the plankton. Where the tiny stuff goes, the shad go, up and down, every day. And your bass, your walleye, your crappie, your stripers, they follow the shad. The whole water column breathes in and out once a day, down at dawn, up at dusk, and every predator in the lake is strapped to the same elevator, whether they know it or not. That is the layer you actually want, not the temperature line, the moving line of dinner riding above it. Let me make the movement itself real to you, because this is the part that turns a mark on a screen into a fish in the net. Fish do not chase a depth, they chase a light level. Picture a specific brightness, a certain dimness of light, holding at some depth in the water. Scientists call that an isolumum, a line of equal light, and animals track it up and down like it's painted on the water. There is a documented case of a megamouth shark, a deep ocean giant, tracked following its light level down to nearly 500 feet in the daytime, just to stay glued to the layer where its food was hiding. 500 feet, chasing a brightness. Your largemouth is doing the exact same thing in 20 feet of water off a main lake point. It is not sitting on a number, it is riding a light level. So think about what the sun does to that. On a bright, cloudless bluebird day, the kind that feels like it should be perfect, the light drives deep, so the whole elevator, plankton, shad, and base gets shoved down. That is why noon on a slick, calm, sunny day is so often a desert. The table didn't disappear, it sank. Now, an overcast day, thick clouds all afternoon, and that same layer rides high all day long, and the fish feed shallow and stay catchable for hours. And here is the one I want you to test on your very next trip. Watch what happens when a single fat cloud slides across the sun on an otherwise bright day. The light drops, the layer lifts, and the bite flips on like somebody hit a switch. Anglers have felt that their whole lives and called it luck. It isn't luck. It's the elevator jumping a few feet the second the light changed. Now I owe you an honest caveat, because this crowd checks the work, and because getting it wrong would send you fishing dead water. The line your sonar draws is a temperature line. It is not an oxygen line. Most of the time, in most lakes, they sit close enough together that it doesn't matter. But in richer, greener, more fertile lakes, the oxygen can actually dip in the middle layer, lower than the water just above and below it. Limnologists call that a metalimnetic oxygen minimum, and it means the real hard floor on how deep that feeding elevator can run isn't the fuzzy gray line you can see. It's an oxygen line you can't. In one study on Amisk Lake in Alberta, an oxygen squeeze in that middle layer pinned more than 70% of the fish up into the top of the lake. And walleye have been tracked riding a specific low oxygen line, right around 3 parts per million, sliding up and down as internal waves shove that line around under the surface. So picture it clearly. The elevator has a hard floor set by breath, oxygen, that you cannot see, and it has a moving car set by light that you can learn to read. 2 invisible walls, 1 visible one, and everybody's out there fishing, the only one that doesn't move. All right, enough theory. Let's put this on your screen and in your hands, because every bit of it is free and you can do it on your next trip. The single most useful thing on your fish finder in summer is not the Thermocline line at all. It's the bait cloud, and specifically whether that cloud is rising or sinking. So here's the routine. When you get on the water at first light, mark the depth of the bait. Just note it. Now go fish, and check it again mid-morning and again at noon. You will watch that cloud slide down through the water column as the sun climbs. Then, late in the day, watch it climb back up. You are not guessing at a magic number anymore. You are watching the dinner table move in real time, and you're setting your bait to wherever it is right now, not to where it was yesterday, or where some video told you it lives. And there are 2 windows every day when that elevator is moving fastest, and those are the windows that fill boats. First light and last light. The old-timers call it the magic hour, and there is a hard reason it works. Those are the moments the light is changing fastest, so the whole layer is on the move. And here's the ambush part. In that low, sliding light, the predator can still see well enough to hunt, but the baitfish can't see well enough to escape. The deck is stacked toward the hunter for those few gray minutes at dawn and again at dusk. That is not folklore. That is a predator exploiting a light window, and it is the single most reliable pattern in freshwater. So how do you get your bait to the moving layer without fancy gear? Simplest thing in the world. If the cloud is at, say, 18 feet, count a spoon or a jig down, roughly 1 foot per second on most lines, and stop it at the cloud. For a crankbait, remember that thinner line lets the bait dig a foot or two deeper, and heavier line holds it up shallower, so you adjust your line, not just your lure. But the whole rule collapses to one sentence. Match the cloud. Put your bait at the depth the bait is, right now, and let a fish that's already looking up come and take it. Because that's the other secret in the movement. A fish riding under that layer will nearly always come up to eat, and almost never dig down. So you air high. You hold your bait at the top of the cloud or just above it, never below. And 2 quick reads that'll keep you from fishing the wrong line. First, how do you even tell the bait cloud apart from the thermocline on the screen? The thermocline holds flat, thin, and dead steady at one depth, hour after hour, like somebody drew it with a ruler. The bait cloud has texture. It clumps, it stretches, it drifts, and most of all, it moves through the day. So here's your tell, and it's the whole thesis of this video in one line. If the mark is sliding up or down as the hours pass, that's food. If it's parked flat and never budges, that's the fence. Second, let the wind do half your work for free. Wind pushes the surface water across the lake, and it pushes the plankton right along with it, piling that whole living soup up against the downwind shore. So on a breezy day, the bait stacks on the wind-blown bank, and the feeding layer gets shoved up shallow, right there against it. Now watch what everybody does. They run to the calm, pretty, sheltered side of the lake where it's comfortable to fish. And the fish are very often on the ugly, choppy, wind-in-your-face bank, eating in 6 feet of water. That is free intelligence, and the wind hands it to you every single time it blows. And you want a clock that works when your phone's dead and the screen's washed out in the sun? Watch the shade. When the shadow from the bank or the trees or the bluff finally stretches out and touches the water in the evening, the light is dropping and the window is cracking open. It is the oldest fish finder there is, and it costs nothing, and it's never wrong. And once that shade hits the water, start reading the surface, because the elevator reaching the top leaves fingerprints you can see from 100 yards. You'll notice the water gets nervous, little dimples and flicks as the shad push up under the film. And if there are gulls or terns anywhere on that lake, watch where they drop, because birds are the original bait finder, and they'll be sitting over the exact spot the shad came up before you ever mark it on sonar. Birds working a stretch of water at last light means the layer has reached the top and the predators are stacked underneath it. Point the boat at the birds. They fish for a living, and they don't miss. Now let me step on a few toes, because you all like a good argument in the comments, and this one's earned. Back in 1926, a man named John Alden Knight built the solunar tables. He took 33 different things people believed moved the fish, tested them, and threw out all but 3: the sun, the moon, and the tides. And to this day, millions of anglers plan their trips around the moon, phase off those tables. Here's what I want you to notice. Knight kept the sun, the half of his theory that is mechanically bulletproof, the half backed by everything we just walked through, is the light half, the daily elevator. The moon position half is the part that's still argued over and never cleanly proven. So I'm not telling you to delete your Solunar app. I'm telling you the sun is doing the heavy lifting on that table every single day, right on schedule, and the moon is along for the ride. Fish the light first, let the moon break ties. And this is the moment to ask the question the whole channel is built on. If this daily elevator is real, if it's been in the science for decades, why has no tackle company ever put it on a package? Why did you have to stumble into it? Simple. You cannot patent a light level. There is no product to sell you called dusk. The plankton rising 8 feet at sundown does not have a barcode, doesn't restock every spring, doesn't sit on an end cap in a new color. The industry makes its money selling you the lure and selling you the $1,500 unit. It does not make a dime selling you the clock, because the clock is free and it already came with the planet. That's the whole reason this stays quiet. Not a conspiracy, just economics. Nobody advertises the thing they can't ring up at the register. And before you think this is only a base thing, it isn't, and that matters for whatever you chase. Crappies suspend right in that layer and ride it up and down all summer, which is exactly why they seem to vanish and reappear. Walleye feed hardest right in those low-light windows, dawn and dusk, and go quiet in the bright middle of the day, and now you know it's not their mood, it's the elevator and the light. Stripers and hybrids blow up the surface at first light and last light, crashing shad that followed the plankton up to the top of the lake, and there's real tracking work on striped bass, showing how tightly their daily movement follows that cycle. Even trout key on the same clock, keying on the bugs and the bait that key on the light. Different fish, same elevator. Learn to read the one moving layer, and you've unlocked the entire lake in summer, top to bottom. So here is the one thing to carry out of all this, and never forget. The Thermocline shows you the room. The light rings the dinner bell, and it rings twice a day, at the two edges of the light, dawn and dusk, when the whole table is on the move. Stop fishing the number. Start fishing the clock. Next time that reliable spot goes dead at noon, don't panic and don't race off to new water. Look at your bait cloud, notice it slid deeper, drop down to meet it, and then wait for the shade to touch the water, because in about an hour that whole layer is going to rise up and start feeding, and you'll be the only boat still sitting on it. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the honest version, not the polite one. Are you Team Solunar, planning your trips around the moon? Or are you Team Light Clock, dawn and dusk and nothing in between? Do me one favor. Go dig up the times your best 3 fish of this whole year actually bit, the real hogs, and put them in the comments. Just the time of day. I am willing to bet money that when you stack them up, they cluster hard around first light and last light, and the moon phase is all over the place. Prove me wrong. I genuinely want to see it, because if your data breaks the pattern, that's a video too. And there's one more thing about that first magic window I didn't tell you, because it deserves its own story. There's a reason your very first cast of the morning matters more than the next 50, and it has nothing to do with confidence or fresh legs. It's a specific thing the fish do in the last gray minutes before real daylight, a window that opens for about 15 minutes and then slams shut, and most anglers sleep right through it or waste it tying knots. That's the next one. So if you don't want to miss it, you know what the subscribe button's for. One last thing before you go, and I mean this every time. Seasons, size limits, slot rules, and which methods are even legal all change from one lake and one state to the next, and they change more often than you'd think. So before you head out, check your state and local regulations. It takes 2 minutes, and it keeps this whole thing honest. The full field blueprint for reading the moving layer, the boat side clock, the countdown to depth numbers, the species notes, and a laminatable checklist you can keep in the boat is free in the description. Because the fish were never gone at noon, they just took the elevator down, and they'll be back up by dark.